There was a forbidden record so dangerous that powerful men tried to erase it from history, not because it was fiction, but because generation after generation kept finding evidence that it was true. A text older than the flood described beings that should never have existed after the waters came. Yet somehow, every civilization encountered traces of them exactly where the ancient writings warned they would be. The Greeks feared them. Mesopotamian priests wrote rituals against them. Hebrew scholars whispered about them in hidden traditions. Centuries later, medieval Europe hunted shadows of the same mystery without realizing what they were truly chasing. The writings themselves were condemned and removed after the 4th century. But destroying the pages changed nothing. The influence had already spread into the world long before the fires began. What survived was deeper than myth and older than empire. Genesis 6 hints at it with terrifying simplicity. The sons of God saw the daughters of men that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose. And after that union came the Nephilim, beings tied to violence, corruption, and a world descending into chaos before the flood. But the flood did not erase everything. Something endured beyond the waters. Something carried through bloodlines, legends, forbidden knowledge, and stories scattered across civilizations separated by oceans and centuries. The Book of Enoch calls them the Watchers, beings who crossed a boundary heaven never intended to be crossed. They did not leave behind only giants. They left behind knowledge, influence, a corruption that buried itself so deeply into human history that every age gave it a different name while never fully escaping its shadow. And before we uncover those names, we have to go back to the beginning. Before the rain started falling, the deeper we dig into the ancient world, the clearer one truth becomes. The Book of Enoch was never treated like an ordinary text. Long before later councils rejected it, its imagery and warnings echoed through the beliefs of early believers. The Epistle of Jude even preserves a direct quotation. "Behold, the Lord cometh with 10,000s of his saints, to execute judgment upon all." The language of chained angels, heavenly rebellion and corrupted powers appears again in 2 Peter and throughout Revelation like fragments of a forgotten history hidden in plain sight. For centuries, many dismissed Enoch as legend. But history took an unexpected turn when ancient manuscripts survived far beyond the reach of suppression. While parts of the world abandoned the text, the Ethiopian tradition preserved it continuously, guarding copies through generations while kingdoms rose and collapsed around them. Then came the discovery near the Dead Sea. Inside remote caves were fragments older than Christianity itself, texts studied by the Qumran community alongside writings such as Isaiah and Deuteronomy. Among them were portions connected to Enoch and the Book of Giants. Suddenly, what many claimed was a medieval invention stood revealed as an ancient tradition rooted deep in the pre-Christian world, and buried inside those texts was a disturbing pattern. They described beings descending from heaven. They described forbidden knowledge given to humanity. They described women transformed through contact with powers beyond the natural order. Genesis records the event in only a few terrifying lines. There were giants in the earth in those days, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them. But Enoch expands the story far beyond Genesis. It describes how corruption spread through the earth until violence consumed civilization itself. Weapons, sorcery, enchantments, astrology, and hidden arts flowed into humanity through the Watchers. What began as temptation became contamination. And what followed was so catastrophic that Scripture says, "The earth also was corrupt before God, and the earth was filled with violence." And this is where the mystery becomes impossible to ignore. Because cultures separated by continents and centuries all preserved echoes of the same female figures. Powerful, feared, connected to forbidden knowledge, and linked somehow to beings that descended from above. The similarities are too precise to dismiss casually. To understand why those patterns repeat across the ancient world, we have to go back before Babylon, before Greece, before the nations divided after Babel, back to the world that existed before the flood. Before the flood, the world described in ancient tradition was not like the world we know now. The barrier between heaven and earth was portrayed as thinner, a time when humanity stood dangerously close to forces beyond its understanding. According to the Book of Enoch, there were watchers assigned over creation, heavenly beings entrusted with observation, not rulership. Yet something changed. The ancient texts discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls preserved fragments of that forgotten account. Despite centuries of rejection and controversy, the writings endured. And within them is a story far darker than mythology. Enoch describes a group of watchers who looked upon humanity and chose rebellion. The sons of God saw the daughters of men that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose. What Genesis records briefly, Enoch expands with unsettling detail. These beings descended upon Mount Hermon and bound themselves together by oath, fully aware they were crossing a forbidden boundary. What followed was not described as simple temptation. It was the corruption of order itself. The Watchers revealed knowledge humanity was never meant to possess so early in history. Ancient writings associate them with weapons of war, metalworking, astrology, enchantments, secret arts, and the manipulation of nature. Enoch names figures like Azazel, who taught men instruments of destruction and taught humanity forbidden practices that spread violence through the earth. And the change did not stop with knowledge. From those unions came the Nephilim. Genesis declares, there were giants in the earth in those days. Ancient tradition portrays them as beings outside the natural order, neither fully human nor fully divine. Their presence became linked with chaos, bloodshed, and fear spreading across the world. Enoch describes the earth crying out under corruption as mankind collapsed deeper into violence. Scripture says, "And God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth." The flood was not presented merely as judgment on isolated sin, but as a response to a world spiraling into total ruin. But one mystery remained. The giants perished in the flood. Yet the ancient texts imply that the corruption behind them did not fully disappear. Enoch describes restless spirits left wandering after the destruction of their physical bodies. Other traditions remain strangely silent about the women connected to the Watchers, as though later generations preserved only fragments of what was once widely known. That silence matters, because after the flood, the same patterns begin appearing again. The same forbidden knowledge, the same mysterious figures tied to supernatural influence, the same stories emerging across civilizations that never should have shared the same memory. Something survived the waters. History never stopped carrying its shadow. And what comes next makes the pattern even harder to dismiss. Because the deeper these ancient records are compared, the harder it becomes to dismiss them as coincidence. Stay with this investigation until the end, because the final names connected to these accounts were feared across civilizations for thousands of years. Now the first witness steps forward, ancient Greece. This was not a civilization built on superstition alone. The Greeks mapped the stars, measured geometry, debated philosophy, and laid foundations for medicine and logic that still influence the modern world. Yet buried beneath all that intellect was a deep fear of certain female entities connected to powers older than Olympus itself. One figure stood above the rest. The Greeks described a woman so terrible that even powerful heroes avoided meeting her gaze. Her presence defied nature. A single look could transform living flesh into lifeless stone. At first glance, the story sounds like myth, but when compared with the traditions surrounding the Watchers, the details become strangely familiar. Ancient Jewish writings beyond Genesis suggest the corruption of the Watchers did not begin physically. Influence came first through visions, seduction, altered perception, and forbidden revelation. Long before destruction appeared outwardly, something changed inwardly. The mind was affected before the body followed. That pattern echoes through Greek tradition. The woman later known as Medusa was not always portrayed as monstrous. Early versions of the story describe transformation, a crossing from one state into another after contact with forbidden power. Serpents crowned her head, symbols long associated throughout the ancient Near East with hidden wisdom and dangerous knowledge. The Greeks understood that something had happened to her, something irreversible. And that is what makes the parallels disturbing. The Book of Enoch repeatedly connects corruption with forbidden instruction. And Azazel taught men to make swords and knives and shields. Other watchers revealed enchantments, astrology, and hidden arts. Knowledge became the doorway through which corruption entered the world. Greek mythology preserves the same warning in symbolic form. But Greece carried another memory as well. Not just women who transformed, but women whose voices overpowered human will itself. The sirens were not feared because of physical strength. They were feared because they reached deeper than reason. Their voices bypassed logic and drew men toward destruction while fully aware of the danger. Even Odysseus, famed for wisdom and discipline, had to be bound to the mast of his ship while his crew sealed their ears against the sound. That is not ordinary temptation. It reflects the same ancient pattern described in the traditions surrounding the Watchers. Influence entering through perception, desire, fascination, and inner surrender before destruction ever appears outwardly. The danger was not brute force. The danger was transformation from within. And this is why the Greek witness matters so much, because Greece did not describe these figures as random monsters. They were remnants of an older memory, fragments passed down from a world before the flood. A world where humanity believed certain boundaries had been crossed, and where the consequences never fully disappeared. The deeper we compare these traditions, the harder coincidence becomes to defend. But Greece was only the first civilization to preserve fragments of this ancient memory. But the second witness reaches even deeper into antiquity, back beyond classical civilization, beyond Homer, into the oldest cities humanity ever built. This witness speaks through clay tablets buried beneath the sands of Mesopotamia. The civilizations of Sumer and Babylon preserved accounts of mysterious feminine entities connected to powers descending from the heavens. These records are ancient enough to stand beside the earliest biblical traditions themselves. And unlike later myths shaped by centuries of retelling, many of these inscriptions come from the foundations of recorded civilization. One figure appears again and again in Mesopotamian tradition, a night-associated female presence tied to desolation, spiritual danger, and influence over human life. Ancient incantation texts describe rituals designed to protect households from her approach. Priests carried amulets, recited invocations, and treated the threat as something requiring active defense. That detail matters. Babylon was not an undeveloped culture ruled by fear alone. This was a civilization of astronomy, mathematics, law, and monumental architecture. Yet even there, traditions persisted about beings connected to those who came from above. In several ancient accounts, these entities were associated with heavenly descent, forbidden power, and knowledge originating beyond the human realm. The parallels to Genesis become difficult to ignore. There were giants in the earth in those days, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men. Across different cultures, separated by language and geography, the same structure keeps appearing. Descent from above, forbidden union, transformation, and corruption spreading into the world. But Mesopotamian tradition adds another layer. Some of the oldest descriptions do not portray these figures as creatures born evil from the beginning. They are depicted as changed beings, figures marked by transition, carrying traces of what they once were before becoming something feared. That idea mirrors the ancient traditions surrounding the women connected to the Watchers. Transformation after contact with forbidden knowledge and power. And once again, the same symbols emerge, a connection to the night, influence beyond normal human ability, attraction mixed with terror, power that affects the mind, the will, and the natural order itself. These are not random similarities scattered across mythology. The patterns align too closely. Even the prophet Daniel, who lived within Babylon, warned of hidden spiritual powers operating behind earthly kingdoms. Scripture declares, "We wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world." The ancient world consistently viewed certain forces as real influences moving behind civilization itself. That is what makes the second witness so important. Babylon did not simply preserve myths. It preserved memory, fragments of a catastrophe older than its own empire. And when its testimony is placed beside Greece, the overlap becomes impossible to dismiss casually. Both describe feminine figures connected to heavenly descent. Both describe transformation. Both describe supernatural influence operating through seduction, fear, and hidden knowledge. And both point back toward the same forbidden event before the flood. Greece preserved one fragment. Babylon preserved another. But the third witness comes from even closer to the biblical source itself. But the third witness is the most difficult to ignore because it rises from within the same tradition that preserved Genesis itself. Ancient Hebrew writings contain traces of a figure surrounded by mystery, fear, and debate for centuries. Rabbis discussed her carefully, often indirectly, because the implications reached into questions official theology struggled to explain completely. References appear scattered through later Jewish tradition, in the Talmud, mystical commentaries, and the Zohar, where fragments of older beliefs survived beneath layers of symbolism. One name repeatedly emerged from those shadows: Lilith. Over time, traditions connected her with wilderness, night, spiritual rebellion, and separation from the order established in Eden. Some writings portrayed her as fleeing into chaos rather than remaining within the structure God created. Others associated her with corrupted unions and beings outside ordinary categories. And this is where the parallels become impossible to overlook. The same themes appear again. Connection with fallen powers, association with forbidden knowledge, existence at the boundary between worlds, a link to corruption spreading through humanity. The Book of Enoch describes the Watchers crossing limits established by heaven itself. Genesis records the consequences in only a few lines, but later traditions attempted to explain what happened after those boundaries collapsed. The sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them. The event was remembered not simply as disobedience, but as a violation of created order. Some Hebrew traditions later described this corruption through the idea of mixed or distorted spiritual inheritance. The language was symbolic, but the warning remained consistent. Something entered the human story that did not belong there. And that same pattern appears again in Babylon and Greece, the feminine figure tied to the night, the connection to beings descending from above, the mixture of attraction and fear, the transformation after contact with forbidden power. 3 civilizations, 3 witnesses, 1 repeating structure. Even the prophet Isaiah contains a mysterious reference that later traditions connected to this imagery. The screech owl also shall rest there. Some ancient translations rendered the term in ways later associated with Lilith traditions, showing how deeply these ideas had embedded themselves into cultural memory. But the Hebrew witness adds something even more unsettling. Unlike Greek mythology, which preserved the story through symbolic monsters, or Babylonian rituals, which focused on protection from supernatural forces, Hebrew tradition tied the corruption directly to lineage and transmission. Ancient writings surrounding Jubilees and Enoch suggest the consequences of the Watchers did not vanish instantly after the flood. Instead, echoes of that corruption continued moving through history in hidden form, not always visible, not always active, but preserved. That idea appears repeatedly in ancient thought, a dormant inheritance waiting for the right conditions to awaken. The Book of Jubilees hints at knowledge passing beyond the flood. Later traditions struggled to explain why traces of giants, forbidden practices, and supernatural corruption seemed to reappear after Noah's generation. Scripture itself raises the question. Long after the flood, the Bible still records giant clans in the land of Canaan. The Emims dwelt therein in times past, a people great, and many and tall as the Anakims. The pattern did not end as neatly as many expected, and that unresolved mystery terrified later generations. Because if the flood destroyed the world before, why did the echoes remain afterward? The Hebrew witness leaves that mystery unresolved, and the next civilization would preserve the fear in a completely different form. But the next witness will not speak through scrolls, myths, or temple records. The disturbing part is not that one culture recorded these figures, it's that completely different civilizations described the same pattern again and again. Do you think these similarities are only mythology, or fragments of a forgotten memory preserved across history? Then history shifts forward into medieval Europe, where the same fear reappears beneath a new name. The fourth witness does not emerge from ruined temples or ancient clay tablets. It rises from court records, confessions, fear, and the fires that swept across medieval Europe. For centuries, entire regions became consumed by accusations of witchcraft. From the 15th through 17th centuries, thousands stood trial, and many of the accused were women believed to possess knowledge ordinary people could not explain. The fear surrounding them was not only about superstition, it was about influence, hidden practices, and contact with powers believed to exist beyond the visible world. One document became infamous during that era, the Malleus Maleficarum. Written in the late 15th century, it attempted to identify signs of forbidden practices and spiritual corruption. The investigators searched for people associated with secret knowledge of herbs, celestial movements, rituals, and unseen entities. Whether their conclusions were right or wrong, the fear itself reveals something important. Medieval society believed certain forms of hidden knowledge had survived across generations. And once again, the pattern echoes the ancient world. The Book of Enoch describes the Watchers teaching forbidden arts to humanity. Enchantments, astrology, secret knowledge, and practices linked to spiritual rebellion. And there arose much godlessness. And they committed fornication, and they were led astray. What began before the flood was remembered as corruption spreading through civilization itself. The Book of Jubilees continues that warning by suggesting that not all traces of this knowledge disappeared after the floodwaters receded. Ancient traditions wrestled with the same question repeatedly. If judgment cleansed the earth, why did echoes of the corruption continue appearing afterward? Scripture itself records unsettling clues. After the flood, giant clans are still mentioned throughout the Old Testament. The Anakim, the Rephaim, or king of Bashan, whose enormous bedstead is specifically described in Deuteronomy. When the spies entered Canaan, they declared, "We saw the giants, the sons of Anak, and we were in our own sight as grasshoppers." The memory remained alive. This also helps explain why the Mosaic laws treated sorcery and occult practices with such seriousness. Ancient Israel viewed these practices not as harmless rituals, but as dangerous connections to powers that opposed the order established by God. The warnings were severe because the perceived threat was severe. But the fourth witness adds one final and disturbing element. By the medieval era, people no longer remembered the language of the Watchers or the Nephilim. The original framework had been buried beneath centuries of fragmented tradition. Yet the same fears persisted: hidden knowledge, spiritual corruption, influence passed from generation to generation, and mysterious practices believed to originate from ancient sources no one fully understood anymore. The names changed, the cultures changed, the explanations changed, but the pattern remained. From Greece to Babylon, from Hebrew tradition to medieval Europe, every witness preserved fragments of the same ancient memory. A memory tied to beings descending from above, forbidden knowledge entering humanity, and consequences that survived long after the flood itself. The Book of Enoch describes the Watchers teaching forbidden arts to humanity. Enchantments, astrology, secret knowledge, and practices linked to spiritual rebellion. And there arose much godlessness, and they committed fornication, and they were led astray. What began before the flood was remembered as corruption spreading through civilization itself. The Book of Jubilees continues that warning by suggesting that not all traces of this knowledge disappeared after the floodwaters receded. Ancient traditions wrestled with the same question repeatedly. If judgment cleansed the earth, why did echoes of the corruption continue appearing afterward? Scripture itself records unsettling clues. After the flood, giant clans are still mentioned throughout the Old Testament. The Anakim, the Rephaim, or king of Bashan, whose enormous bedstead is specifically described in Deuteronomy. When the spies entered Canaan, they declared, "We saw the giants, the sons of Anak, and we were in our own sight as grasshoppers." The memory remained alive. This also helps explain why the Mosaic laws treated sorcery and occult practices with such seriousness. Ancient Israel viewed these practices not as harmless rituals, but as dangerous connections to powers that opposed the order established by God. The warnings were severe because the perceived threat was severe. But the fourth witness adds one final and disturbing element. By the medieval era, people no longer remembered the language of the Watchers or the Nephilim. The original framework had been buried beneath centuries of fragmented tradition. Yet the same fears persisted: hidden knowledge, spiritual corruption, influence passed from generation to generation, and mysterious practices believed to originate from ancient sources no one fully understood anymore. The names changed, the cultures changed, the explanations changed, but the pattern remained. From Greece to Babylon, from Hebrew tradition to medieval Europe, every witness preserved fragments of the same ancient memory. A memory tied to beings descending from above, forbidden knowledge entering humanity, and consequences that survived long after the flood itself. Even more striking is the emotional response these civilizations shared. None treated these figures casually. Greece built myths around warning and fear. Babylon created rituals of protection. Hebrew scholars debated the traditions with caution and discomfort. Medieval authorities reacted with extreme urgency, convinced something dangerous was moving beneath the surface of society. Why? Because ancient people believed corruption was not only physical, it was spiritual, intellectual, and generational. The Book of Enoch presents the Watchers as beings who introduced knowledge humanity was unprepared to handle. And the whole earth has been corrupted through the works that were taught by Azazel. The danger was never portrayed as strength alone. The danger was influence, and influence survives longer than empires. That is why the flood narrative matters so much in these traditions. The waters destroyed the violent world that existed before Noah, but later writings suggest traces of the corruption continued beyond the judgment itself. The Bible repeatedly records the reappearance of giant clans and forbidden practices after the flood, forcing later generations to wrestle with the same unresolved mystery. How could the echoes remain? Ancient traditions attempted to answer that question in different ways. Some spoke of hidden transmission through generations. Others described lingering spiritual corruption attached to forbidden knowledge itself. But all of them agreed on one point: the ancient rebellion left consequences that history never fully erased. And this is why the testimonies matter together, not separately. One civilization alone could be dismissed as mythology. Two could be coincidence. But four independent traditions preserving the same core structure across thousands of years forces a deeper question. What original event created such a lasting memory? Because every witness keeps pointing back to the same source: the days before the flood, the descent of the Watchers, and the corruption that followed them into the human world. After thousands of years of scattered myths and fragmented traditions, the names behind these patterns finally emerge. The fragments preserved by Greece, Babylon, Hebrew tradition, and medieval Europe all appear to point toward the same ancient pattern described in the Book of Enoch. Different cultures gave different names to the figures they feared, but the structure beneath the stories remained remarkably consistent. The Greeks remembered a woman transformed after crossing a forbidden boundary between mortal and supernatural realms. Serpents crowned her head, a symbol long associated in ancient cultures with hidden wisdom and dangerous revelation. Her gaze brought destruction, and even heroes approached her with terror. The world remembers her as Medusa. But beneath the mythology lies a deeper idea: transformation after contact with forbidden power. The Book of Enoch repeatedly warns that the Watchers altered humanity through corrupted knowledge and rebellion against divine order. What Greece preserved in symbolic form mirrors the same ancient fear, that something entered the human world and changed it permanently. The same pattern appears again in the sirens. Greek tradition described them as beings whose voices overpowered reason itself. Men who heard them were drawn away from safety and toward destruction, as though their will had been bypassed entirely. Ancient writings surrounding the Watchers describe temptation operating in a similar way, influence beginning inwardly before destruction manifested outwardly. This is why these stories endured for centuries. They reflected more than monsters. They reflected anxiety about spiritual corruption, seduction through forbidden knowledge, and the collapse of human boundaries. Then comes the Hebrew tradition. Among later mystical writings appears the figure of Lilith, associated in folklore with rebellion, wilderness, and separation from sacred order. Over generations, traditions connected her symbolically to chaos, corrupted unions, and beings outside ordinary categories. While interpretations varied widely, the recurring themes remained strikingly similar to those preserved in Babylonian and Greek memory. Again, the same elements return: the night, forbidden knowledge, supernatural influence, the crossing of boundaries established by God. And then history moves into medieval Europe. There, the language changes once more. The old myths disappear, but the fear survives. Court records and inquisitorial writings describe people accused of possessing hidden knowledge tied to herbs, celestial practices, rituals, and unseen forces. The original world of Enoch had long been forgotten by most, yet echoes of the same ideas remained alive beneath the surface of society. The name given to these figures was witches, whether viewed through folklore, religion, or social fear. The underlying concern remained remarkably similar to the warnings preserved in earlier traditions. Knowledge divorced from divine order becomes destructive. Scripture repeatedly warns humanity about seeking power apart from God. There shall not be found among you anyone that useth divination, or an observer of times, or an enchanter, or a witch. And this is what ties the witnesses together: Medusa, sirens, Lilith, witches. 4 names emerging from 4 different civilizations, yet all carrying echoes of the same ancient memory: the belief that humanity once encountered forbidden powers that reshaped the world before the flood. The Book of Enoch framed that event as the rebellion of the Watchers. Other cultures preserved fragments through myth, legend, and fear. Over time, the original story fractured into symbols and scattered traditions, but the core warning endured. Some boundaries, once crossed, leave consequences that continue long after the original world has disappeared beneath the waters. Now the pattern is complete. The testimonies of Greece, Babylon, Hebrew tradition, and medieval Europe no longer stand isolated from one another. Together, they form a single narrative stretching across thousands of years. A memory of rebellion, forbidden knowledge, and boundaries humanity was never meant to cross. And once that pattern is seen, it becomes difficult to unsee. The ancient world believed the greatest danger was never physical strength alone. It was corruption entering through knowledge, influence, temptation, and the promise of becoming more than human. That warning appears again and again throughout Scripture. In Eden, the serpent offered hidden wisdom. Before the flood, the Watchers brought forbidden knowledge. In every age afterward, humanity continued reaching toward power without wisdom and revelation without obedience. The language changes with each civilization, but the temptation remains the same. The Book of Enoch describes the origin of the rebellion. The Book of Jubilees expands on how corruption continued beyond the flood. Later Hebrew traditions wrestled with why the echoes never completely vanished. Meanwhile, cultures across the world preserved fragments of the same memory through myths, legends, rituals, and fear. 4 witnesses, 4 civilizations, 1 repeating structure. And Scripture itself warns that the struggle behind human history is not merely political or material. For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world. The battle described in ancient texts was always portrayed as spiritual before it became earthly. That is why these stories continue to survive generation after generation. Not because every legend is literal, but because they preserve humanity's oldest fear. That knowledge, separated from God, eventually becomes destruction. The world before the flood pursued power without restraint, and Genesis says the result was total corruption. And God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth. The flood ended that age, but the warning remained. And perhaps that is why these ancient accounts still feel strangely familiar in the modern world. The tools have changed, civilizations have changed, technology has changed. But the desire to surpass human limits without moral boundaries continues to follow the same ancient path. That is the thread connecting every witness in this story. Not merely giants, not merely myths, but the recurring human temptation to seek forbidden power while ignoring the cost. If these ancient connections changed the way you see the world, there are even deeper mysteries hidden in the texts surrounding the Watchers, the Nephilim, and the days before the flood. And the next discovery may be the most unsettling of all. And after thousands of years, the old warnings still remain written across history, like echoes from a world buried beneath the waters.